The veiled diplomat had been standing in the corridor for 11 minutes before anyone noticed she was crying. Not crying the way her species understood it, the controlled release of saline through specialized ducts, a biological signal that could be managed, timed, suppressed with a single exhalation. What she was doing had no name in veil physiological literature. Her body was shaking. The sound coming from her was involuntary, recursive, impossible to stop once it had started. 2 of the human medical staff had already moved toward her, and that was somehow the worst part. They moved toward her, not away. Not with the professional distance of beings observing an anomaly. They moved toward her the way something moves toward a wounded thing, with their hands already open, already offering contact they hadn't been asked for, already certain she needed something even though she couldn't have communicated it in words. "Hey," the shorter one said. Just that. Ambassador Sarathvaln of the Veil Continuity, the species that had successfully negotiated the surrender terms of the Keth Dominion, that had authored the Lyran Compact, that had been the galaxy's most trusted diplomatic voice for 400 years, could not respond. She just stood there in a human corridor, shaking, while 2 beings whose civilization was barely 2,000 years old put their hands gently on her arms and said things quietly in a language she only partially understood, and she thought, "Asterisk, this is what I should have recognized. This is what none of us recognized, asterisk." The Gareth hegemony had surrendered 18 days ago. The war was over. Officially. Completely. Every signatory had signed. Every fleet had stood down. The conclave of rational minds, the governing body that had administered the known galaxy for 6 centuries, had ratified the terms. Historians would later mark that specific stardate as the definitive end of the longest sustained military conflict in recorded spacefaring history. 312 years of expansion, attrition, loss, and negotiation, and it had ended with 37 species affixing their marks to a document that essentially said, asterisk, we cannot continue. We accept what remains, asterisk. Nobody had asked Earth. That was an oversight. Earth had been informed, consulted, kept within the diplomatic loop. Their ambassador, a compact, quiet woman named Mirela Okafor, who had an unsettling habit of listening to things a full 3 seconds longer than any other diplomat before responding, had been present at every session. She had reviewed the terms. She had asked precise, careful questions, the kind that made other ambassadors uncomfortable because they implied the terms had been read more carefully than the people who'd written them. But when the final vote came, Earth had abstained. Not objected. Not rejected. Abstained. Ambassador Okafor had simply said, we need more time to consider the full implications of these terms. And the chamber had moved on because the conclave didn't require unanimity from junior members, and Earth was still, technically, formally, a junior member. Then the Gareth had advanced past the Marin line anyway. That was 18 days ago. Sarathvaln was still trying to understand everything that had happened between then and now, standing in this corridor, with human hands on her arms, unable to stop the shaking. The Gareth had not advanced because they were desperate. That was the first misread, and it was catastrophic. Desperation implied awareness of one's own weakness. The Gareth had advanced because their command structure had run a probability model, the same model they'd run 200 times over 3 centuries, and the model had told them what it always told them, that a signed armistice with terms this favorable would be dishonored within 4 years. Every historical precedent in Gareth's strategic literature agreed. You did not accept terms and wait. You accepted terms, allowed your enemy to begin disarming, and then you advanced before the disarmament was complete, before the relief set in, before the bureaucrats took over from the generals. It wasn't treachery by Gareth ethical standards. It was sequence. It was what you did. The conclave's response had been exactly what the Gareth model predicted. Shock, condemnation, emergency sessions, requests for clarification, proposals for renewed negotiation. 36 of the 37 signatories had immediately recalled their military assets to defensive postures, because the armistice made offensive operations a treaty violation even in response to a treaty violation, and because none of them, not one, wanted to restart the war they had just finished surviving. The diplomatic language became enormous and elaborate and completely hollow. Strongly worded statements were issued. The Gareth advanced another 40 light-years. Earth did not recall its military assets. This was noticed but misinterpreted. The conclave assumed the humans were posturing, projecting forward presence to signal resolve without any intention of actual engagement. It was sophisticated theater, possibly. Or it was a bureaucratic delay. Human governance was notoriously slow. Mirela Okafor had still said almost nothing. She sat in the emergency sessions and she listened and she wrote things on actual paper with an actual physical pen, which several species found deeply strange, and she did not appear alarmed, which was the most alarming thing about her. Ambassador Okafor, the conclave chair, had finally said, directly, with the formal weight of 6 centuries of institutional authority, "We require clarity on Earth's position." She had looked up from her paper. She had that pause, the 3-second pause that everyone had learned to wait through. "We're handling it," she said. The chamber had been silent for a very long time. "Handling it," the chair repeated. "Yes. The Gareth hegemony has violated a treaty ratified by this body and is currently advancing on a trajectory that will reach the Selvani cluster in 11 days, Okafor said. "We know." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ambassador," said Sareth Voln, who was the one who had learned to ask the questions others wouldn't, "what exactly is Earth handling?" Okafor had looked at her. Not through her, the way some ambassadors looked when they were composing their next sentence. At her. Like the question mattered specifically because Sareth Voln had asked it, like she was being considered as an individual rather than a role. "The Gareth problem," Okafor said. She had closed her notebook. She had not said anything else. The human vessel was called Ungoverned Persistence. Sareth Voln had found the name in the registry 3 days later, when she was trying to understand the single human ship that had moved to intercept the Gareth advance fleet. One ship. She had read the name 4 times because she was certain she'd mistranslated it. The linguistic databases confirmed she had not. Ungoverned Persistence. She had spent an hour trying to determine whether this was military designation, operational call sign, or, and this was the interpretation that settled into her mind and refused to leave, an actual philosophical statement. The Gareth advance fleet consisted of 47 warships. The military analysts at the conclave had done the math, the way you do math when you're watching a tragedy unfold and the only useful thing left is calculation. A single human vessel of that class against 47 Gareth warships had a survival probability measured not in percent but in fractions of percent. The analysts had written their assessment and sealed it in the official record, and then several of them had gone home early because there are things you calculate that you don't want to have calculated. What happened next took 11 hours. Sareth Voln didn't have the full sensor logs until later. What she had in real time was the fragmentary communications that the Ungoverned Persistence was broadcasting on open frequencies throughout the engagement, which was not a standard military tactic and which the analysts initially thought was either equipment malfunction or deliberate provocation, and which turned out to be something else entirely. The human crew was talking to the Gareth. Not negotiating. Not issuing demands or ultimatums. Talking. The communications were in Gareth, imperfect but comprehensible, and they were addressed not to the fleet admiral but to individual ships. To specific crew designations. The Ungoverned Persistence had, apparently, spent its transit time building a picture of the Gareth fleet from public records, intercepted signals, and whatever intelligence Earth maintained, and someone on board had composed individual messages for 31 of the 47 ships. Personal messages. Referencing specific commanders by name, by record, by the particular engagements they had survived. One message, later translated and entered into the official conclave record, said, *, we know you have been fighting for 300 years. We know what that costs. We are not here to tell you the cost was nothing. We are here to tell you it does not have to continue, *. The Gareth response to this approach was, by their own cultural framework, straightforward. They found it baffling and therefore threatening. Baffling communication from an enemy in a combat scenario was a sign of psychological instability or deliberate obfuscation, both of which indicated danger. They fired on the Ungoverned Persistence in the 7th minute of the engagement. The Ungoverned Persistence did not retreat. This is the part that Sereth Vaughn returned to again and again in the days afterward, trying to find the logic in it. The ship took significant damage in the first exchange. Its propulsion was partially compromised. The tactical calculus at that moment, according to every strategic framework used by every species in the conclave, was unambiguous. A damaged vessel with reduced mobility against 47 opponents had exactly one rational option. It didn't matter whether that option felt like survival or defeat. There was simply only one direction the math pointed. The ungoverned Persistence turned directly toward the Gareth fleet and continued broadcasting. The messages changed. They became more specific. Someone on that ship, and Sereth Vaughn later learned it was not the captain, not a communications officer, but a 26-year-old navigation specialist named Kofi Asante who had apparently asked permission to take over the comm array and been given it. Someone had started talking about individual Gareth casualties. The Gareth lost across 300 years of war. Read aloud. In Gareth, one after another. The Gareth had a profound cultural relationship with named dead. This was known. It had been in diplomatic briefings for 2 centuries. What had not been understood, what Sereth Vaughn herself had not understood despite having read those briefings, was what happened to a Gareth military formation when someone who should by all rights be their enemy began speaking the names of their dead with what could only be described as grief. Not performed grief. Not tactical grief. Kofi Asante's voice, on the recording, was unsteady. He stumbled over some of the pronunciations. He kept going anyway. 4 Gareth ships stopped firing in the 9th minute. Not all of them. Most of them continued. The ungoverned Persistence continued taking damage. Sereth Vaughn had later seen the internal sensor logs from that engagement, and she had needed to set them down and walk away from her desk and stand in front of a viewport looking at empty space for a while before she could continue reading. The ship was on fire in 3 sections. 2 of the crew were dead. 12 were injured. The captain, a woman named Sergeant Commander Ilse Brandt, which told you something about human military rank structure if you examined it closely, had fractured her arm in 2 places when a conduit burst and had it field splinted and had kept issuing orders. She had not called for evacuation. She had not sent a distress signal to the conclave. She had allocated her remaining weapons to keeping specific Gareth ships from achieving flanking positions while Kofi Asante read the names of the dead. Sereth Vaughn had to look up the human concept of holding space for something. She found it in a cultural anthropology database, buried in a section on human grief practices. Holding space. The act of remaining present with someone in pain without attempting to fix, resolve, or remove the pain. Simply staying. Witnessing. It was considered, in human cultures, one of the most meaningful things one being could offer another. The ungoverned Persistence was, on some level she could barely articulate, holding space for the Gareth. While on fire. While dying. 17 Gareth ships had stopped firing by the time the second human vessel arrived. Sereth Vaughn had not known there was a second vessel. She suspected the conclave hadn't either. Earth had not announced it. The vessel, the Unreasonable Hope, and she had checked the translation 4 times, had apparently been traveling on a parallel trajectory outside standard sensor range, and it arrived not with weapons active but broadcasting the same open-frequency communications, now with additional voices, now with what she later learned was a full listing of every Gareth name that human intelligence services had been able to compile across 3 centuries of conflict. Hundreds of thousands of names. It took a long time to read them all. During that time, the Gareth Advance Fleet did not fire on the Unreasonable Hope. Some of this was tactical. The ungoverned Persistence was still functional, still armed, still operating with a kind of determined irrationality that the Gareth tactical AI kept flagging as anomalous. But some of it, and this was what broke something in Sereth Vaughn's understanding when she read the Gareth Fleet Commander's after-action report, which she was not supposed to have access to and which a human intelligence contact sent her anyway without explanation. Some of it was that the Gareth Fleet Commander had given an order to his ships to hold fire because he wanted to hear the names. He had wanted to hear the names. 300 years of dead, being read by an enemy who had no obligation to know them, no strategic reason to know them, who had clearly spent significant resources compiling them, who was doing this while burning, while 2 of their crew were dead, while the tactical situation was objectively hopeless. Fleet Commander Vetharoken of the Gareth Hegemony, a being who had personally commanded 42 engagements over 60 years, who had never in his life retreated from a military order, who the Conclave's psychological profiles described as inflexibly committed to Gareth's strategic doctrine, had listened to the humans read the names of the Gareth dead for 4 hours and 17 minutes, and then he had ordered his fleet to stand down. His official report cited atypical psychological engagement tactics requiring doctrinal review. His personal log, which Sareth Vaughn was absolutely not supposed to have and which she had read sitting alone in her office at 3 a.m, said something different. It said, "They grieved for us. They had no reason to grieve for us. I do not know what to do with this, *." The formal ceasefire negotiations took 9 days. Sareth Vaughn led the conclave delegation. She had been doing this for 40 years. She was considered the finest diplomatic mind the Vale had produced in 3 generations, and she had walked into those 9 days feeling, for the first time in her career, that she was operating in a framework she did not fully understand. Mirela Okafor was present for the human side. She brought 2 people with her. A legal specialist named Dr. Tavian Cross, who was young and absurdly well-prepared and had the disconcerting habit of finishing other people's sentences correctly, and Kofi Asante, who was still technically on medical leave from the ungoverned persistence and who was present, as far as Sareth Vaughn could determine, for no official reason whatsoever. The Gareth delegation arrived and did something unprecedented. They requested that Kofi Asante be seated at the table. He was a navigation specialist. He was 26 years old. He had a burn across his left forearm from the engagement that was still visibly healing. He had no diplomatic credentials, no official standing, no authority to speak for Earth in any formal sense. Okafor had looked at her legal specialist, who had looked at her, and then she had looked at Kofi Asante, and she had said, "Do you want to?" He had said, "Yes." She had said, "Then you are." Just like that. No protocol consulted. No committee convened. The ranking ambassador of Earth's diplomatic corps had given a 26-year-old navigation technician a seat at a ceasefire negotiation because the opposing party had asked for him and he'd said yes. Sareth Vaughn had watched this happen and had felt something shift in her understanding of how humans made decisions, and the shift was not entirely comfortable. The Gareth lead negotiator, not Fleet Commander Vetharoken, who had returned to hegemony space but had submitted a formal diplomatic recommendation that was unprecedented in Gareth history, opened by addressing Kofi Asante directly. She asked him how he had obtained the names. Her tone was not accusatory. It was something Sareth Vaughn had not heard in a Gareth voice before, across 40 years of negotiation. It was something she had to look up afterward. The word, in Vale, was closest to reverence. Kofi Asante had explained that Earth maintained civilian memorial databases. That families of those lost in conflicts sometimes submitted information, hoping it would reach someone. That he had spent the transit time going through 300 years of fragments, incomplete records, partial designations, cross-referencing against intercepted Gareth communications, filling in gaps with probability models, and that he was sorry. He said this directly, with the same unsteady quality his voice had carried during the broadcast, that he had not been able to get all of them, that he had missed some, that he wanted the hegemony to know that if they could provide information, the database would be updated, that the names would not be lost. There was a long silence. The Gareth lead negotiator said, "Why?" Kofi Asante looked at her for a moment. He said, "Because they were people." 3 words. No elaboration. The Gareth lead negotiator was quiet for a very long time. Long enough that Dr. Cross had quietly slid a glass of water toward her. Because humans did that, they slid things toward people in difficult moments, they reached across tables without thinking about it. She did not drink the water, but her hand rested near it. She said, "We will review the terms." This is where Sareth Vaughn had to stop, late in the negotiations, and take a walk. She had been in diplomatic service since she was 19. She had negotiated in the aftermath of the Lyran cluster crisis, the Mendari succession, the Pale War, 3 different territorial disputes in the Outer Reach. She had seen good agreements and she had seen bad ones, and she had seen agreements that failed before the ink was dry, and she had seen the occasional treaty that actually held. She thought she understood the mechanism of it. You found what each party needed, not what they wanted, and you constructed language that let both parties meet their needs without appearing to concede them, and if you were very good at your job, the final document looked like something both parties had wanted all along. What was happening in these negotiations did not follow that mechanism. The Gareth were not negotiating towards strategic interests. They were negotiating towards something she didn't have a clean word for. She observed them across the table, beings she had spent 40 years reading as inflexible, doctrine-bound, strategically determined, and she watched them move, repeatedly, in response not to tactical incentives but to the presence of these specific humans who kept doing things that were not tactically rational. Kofi Asante had started bringing Gareth tea to the morning sessions because he'd learned their physiological preferences from medical databases, and he thought it might help with the long hours, and nobody had asked him to do this. Dr. Cross had at one point spent 40 minutes helping a Gareth Jr. delegate find a specific clause in a 300-year-old hegemony legal document that supported the Gareth position, not the human position, and when she'd found it, she'd handed it to him with the careful satisfaction of someone who valued the finding more than the outcome it implied. Mirela Okafor negotiated with the patience of a geological process. She did not push. She did not hurry. She asked questions that seemed simple and weren't, and she listened to the answers for 3 full seconds every time, and there was something in that listening. Sareth Vaughan watched it across 9 days. That changed the room. The Gareth negotiators began, slowly, to speak more carefully in her presence. Not more guardedly. More carefully, like they were aware that what they said was being genuinely received and wanted to be accurate. At one point Sareth Vaughan caught herself thinking, they trust her. She sat with that for a while. 300 years of conflict. 47 warships and 1 burning human vessel. A 26-year-old reading names. And somewhere in the space between those things, something had cracked open that Sareth Vaughan's entire career had not given her the tools to crack open herself. She went back to the chamber and she finished the work. The agreement they produced was not the armistice the conclave had ratified 18 days earlier. It was different in ways that would take scholars decades to fully analyze. It included provisions no one had thought to ask for: a joint memorial database, maintained by both hegemony and human archivists, updated continuously. A standing council with rotating membership from both civilizations. A clause, and Sareth Vaughan had read it 4 times, that simply said in recognition that the losses of all parties constitute a shared history from which shared future may emerge. She had not written that clause. None of the conclave delegation had written it. She had asked Dr. Cross who had drafted it, and Dr. Cross had smiled, the particular human smile that indicated something slightly complicated, and had said, Kofi wrote it. On the last night. He couldn't sleep and he sent it at 2 in the morning, and Mirela said to put it in. A navigation specialist. Couldn't sleep. Sent it at 2 in the morning. Sareth Vaughan had looked at the clause for a long time. The Gareth hegemony signed. Not reluctantly. Not with the careful performance of a party accepting defeat. Fleet Commander Vetharoken had come in person for the signing, unauthorized, unexpected, not on any protocol document, and he had sat beside the lead negotiator and he had affixed his mark beneath hers, and then he had looked at Kofi Asante across the table and he had said something in Gareth that the translation algorithm rendered as, "The names have been heard." Kofi Asante had said, "Yes." Vetharoken had said, "All of them?" There was a pause. Kofi Asante's expression did something complicated. Sareth Vaughan had been watching him long enough by then to read human faces with some competence, and he said, "Not all. But we keep looking." Vetharoken was still for a long moment. Then he did something that was not in any Gareth diplomatic or military protocol Sareth Vaughan had ever studied. He placed one hand, briefly, on the table between himself and Kofi Asante. Not reaching across. Just placing it there. Present. Kofi Asante placed his hand on the table as well. They stayed like that for a moment. Then the document was sealed and the war, the real war, not the one the armistice had claimed to end, was actually over. This is where Sareth Vaughan had been standing in the corridor. She had been walking back from the signing chamber, processing, cataloging the way she always did after major events, constructing the analytical framework she would use in her report to the Veil continuity. She had been doing this for 40 years. She was good at it. She was the best her species had. And then she had stopped in the corridor and found herself unable to move. Not from pain. Not from injury. From something that didn't have a clean name in Veil language. A feeling of being very small in the presence of something very large, not because the thing was threatening but because you had suddenly understood how much of it you had failed to see. 40 years of diplomatic work. Hundreds of negotiations. The finest training her civilization offered. And she had missed something that a 26-year-old human navigation specialist had intuited so naturally he hadn't even known he was intuiting it. They had not won by being stronger. The ungoverned persistence was nearly destroyed. 2 crew members had died. The tactical situation had been, by every measurement, hopeless. They had not won by being smarter. The Conclave had centuries of diplomatic expertise that Earth simply didn't have. They had not won by being more sophisticated or better equipped or more historically significant. They had won because they could not stop caring. Not as a strategy. Not as a calculated diplomatic approach. Sareth Vaughn had watched these humans for 9 days, and she was a very good reader of beings who were performing versus beings who simply were, and Kofi Asante was not performing grief for the Gareth dead. He had actually felt it. Mirela Okafor was not strategically patient. She was actually listening. Dr. Cross had not tactically helped the Gareth Jr. delegate find that clause. She had simply found it helpful to find it. They just kept caring. Under pressure. Under fire. After loss. When it made no tactical sense. When it cost them. They just kept doing it. And the Gareth, who had fought for 300 years and had a model, a reliable model, that told them exactly how civilizations behaved under pressure, had run into something their model had no category for. They had applied force to these humans and the humans had not responded with force or fear or retreat. They had responded by reading the names of the Gareth dead. They had applied strategic pressure and the humans had responded by listening, by passing tea across the table, by sending clauses at 2 in the morning because they couldn't sleep. The Gareth model kept generating anomalies. The anomalies kept accumulating. And Fleet Commander Vetharoken, 60 years a soldier, had looked at Kofi Asante across a table and recognized something in him that his 300 years of doctrine could not classify. Sareth Vaughn was standing in the corridor and she was making the sound that humans made when something broke through and she could not stop. And the 2 humans had come toward her. Not away. Not at a professional distance. Hey, the shorter one said. She stood there for a moment. She didn't have the words, not in Veil, not in the Conclave's common tongue, not in any of the 6 languages her career had required her to learn. She stood there in a human corridor with human hands on her arms and she tried to find language for what she was feeling. What she was feeling was, I have spent 40 years trying to understand how civilizations survive. I have studied history and strategy and diplomacy and the mathematics of conflict, and I missed this. I missed the simplest thing. The thing they do without thinking. The thing they do on fire at 2 in the morning, after 2 of their people are dead, when the math says it's already over, asterisk. They stay. They grieve. They listen. They read the names. I'm okay, she said, which was a human phrase she had learned early in her career and had never fully understood until this moment, because it was not a factual statement. It rarely was, in the human mouths she'd heard it from, it was an act of reaching. A signal that said, asterisk, I am here. I can be spoken to. Don't worry about me, although I know you will anyway, and I am grateful that you will, asterisk. Okay, the human said. We're here anyway, though. She laughed. She had not expected to laugh. It was a short, involuntary sound, very close to the crying, and the human looked alarmed for a moment and then she laughed too, and they stood there in the corridor together for a little while. The Conclave's official record would describe the resolution of the Gareth crisis in terms of strategic intervention, diplomatic innovation, and what the official language called unorthodox but effective engagement methodology. It would note the contribution of Earth's diplomatic mission. It would recommend that future conclave crisis protocols include consultation with human representatives at earlier stages. It would not capture what Sereth Vaughn wrote in her personal file, the one she kept separate from official records, the one that contained the actual texture of 40 years. She wrote in it that night, sitting in her quarters on the human station, with the stars outside her viewport and the distant fact of a signed agreement and 2 dead crew members on a ship called the Ungoverned Persistence. She wrote, "They are not the most powerful species in this galaxy. They are not the oldest or the most sophisticated or the most strategically capable. They were junior members of the Conclave 40 years ago and they remain, technically, junior members now. But something happened today that I need to record accurately because I think it matters. We had all surrendered to the idea that the Gareth could not be reached. Not formally, we had not written it anywhere. But we had built our response around it. The armistice, the diplomatic language, the emergency sessions, all of it was constructed around a quiet certainty that the Gareth were operating within a model that no amount of negotiation could interrupt. We were managing the situation. We were applying every tool 3 centuries of civilizational experience had given us, and we were managing toward acceptable outcomes rather than real ones, because real outcomes require you to believe the other party can change, and we had, quietly, collectively, without ever saying so, stopped believing that, the humans had not. Or if they had, it didn't change what they did, I don't think they are naive. I watched Mirela Okafor for 9 days and she is one of the most precisely intelligent beings I have encountered in this work. I don't think Kofi Asante compiled 3 centuries of war dead without understanding what he was doing or why it might not work. They are not naive. They simply have a relationship with futility that I don't think any other species in this conclave has, They appear to experience futility as an argument they can continue having. Not a conclusion, I don't know what to do with this. I'm not sure any of us do. I'm not sure the Gareth do either, and they were on the receiving end of it, What I know is that the war is over. The real one. And it ended not with strategy or superior force or historical inevitability but because one ship kept broadcasting when it should have run, and one young man couldn't sleep, and one woman listened long enough that it changed what listening meant in that room, And I know that somewhere in hegemony space, Fleet Commander Vetharoken is in his quarters or on his bridge or wherever he goes when a thing is done, and he is thinking about a hand placed on a table. Not reaching across. Just present. Just there. That's all it was. That's all any of it was, That is, I think, exactly the problem. For the rest of us, that's all it was, is a diminishment. It means the thing was smaller than it appeared. For humans, I am beginning to understand that, that's all it was, is a statement of profundity. As if simplicity is the point. As if remaining present and continuing to care and reading the names of the dead and placing your hand on a table and just staying, past every rational moment when a civilization with any instinct for self-preservation would finally stop, As if all of that is the most that can ever be asked of anyone. And they do it like it's ordinary. That is the most frightening thing I have encountered in 40 years of this work. Not because it threatens us. Because it makes me wonder what we have been surrendering all this time, that we never had to. She closed the file. Outside the viewport, the stars held their positions, indifferent and permanent, scattered across the dark the way light always is, never asking permission, never calculating odds, simply arriving and continuing to arrive, long past any reasonable expectation that it matters.